Hello and welcome. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Emily Connor and I work at the Audubon Center at Riverlands. We're so glad that you could join us for this virtual presentation. Today, we're going to be learning about the Mississippi Watershed and pollution. Now, since we're going to be talking about watersheds, let's cover all the water that we have on Earth first.
All right, hello everybody. So today we are going to be taking a look at all of the water that we have in the world. And when you think about the water we have in the world, it sure does seem like we have a lot of it, right? But just how much of that is actually fresh, drinkable water? Well, we're going to actually do a demonstration together today to find out just how much. So as you can see, I have a container of water here with about 1,000 milliliters of water. And this is going to represent all of the water that we have in our world. So imagine I took all of the water and I was able to put it in this container here. Now, when you think about water on Earth, where does most of it come from? And something that pops into my head is our oceans. We have lots of oceans, lots of salt water, right? So in fact, we have about 97% of our total water is going to be our salt water. So to represent that, I'm going to actually measure out our 970 milliliters. So I'm going to take a measuring cup and measure out 30. All right, that looks like about 30. So again, this is our salt water. Now it's important to remember that salt water is not consumable by humans. So I'm going to make sure to put some salt in here so we know this is not drinking water, right? This is our salt water from our oceans. So we have about 30 milliliters left. This is about 3% total. And this is representing all of the fresh water that we have in the world. Now, when we think about all of our fresh water, it can be in different forms. So how do you think the water is on our Earth's poles? So thinking about the North Pole and the South Pole, what state is our water in? So it's quite cold there. So we actually have quite a bit of frozen fresh water. So this would be water in our glaciers and ice caps. So that's actually about 2.4%. So I'm going to be measuring out 24 milliliters. So we're going to take out about 6. Took a little bit too much. All right, so that looks like about 24. And to represent our frozen fresh water, I'm going to pour our 24 milliliters, about 2.4% of our total water, into our ice cube tray. All right, so this is what we have left. We have about 6 milliliters of water left. And so this is representing all of our fresh water. Now what's left, there's 2 different ways you can get our fresh water other than from glaciers. We could have groundwater or surface water. And so a majority of this is actually going to be our groundwater, almost about 2.4%. And so, about 0.6%. And so of that, only about 0.0003% is our surface drinkable water. And so to represent that, I'm actually going to take a drop of this water, and that equals about 1.5 milliliters. So I'm going to take about 1 drop, 1.5 milliliters, and I'm going to place it on this lid here. And our remaining is our groundwater. So again, let's recap. So out of all of the water in the world, about 97% is our salt water, which we'd find in our oceans. About 2.4% is frozen fresh water we'd find in our North and South Pole, in our ice caps and glaciers. About 0.6% is our fresh groundwater. And the remaining 1.5 milliliters, which is about 0.0003%, is our fresh surface water. So as you can see, This precious drop must be managed properly because this is our drinking water that we have in the world. So hopefully this demonstration just shows you just how important it is that we protect that water, because that's all that we have. So now that we've gotten a chance to look at all the water that we have in the world, we're going to be diving in a little bit deeper on what's actually happening to our surface freshwater today.
All right, so now let's take a look at where we're located on a map. So as you can see, we are located at the red arrow, and you can see the Mississippi and Missouri River quite well here. Look at how far they are stretching. These are quite large rivers, and they're very important in our watershed. Now this is actually a map of our Mississippi watershed, and we'll take a look at this again in just a moment. All right, so I showed you a picture of our Mississippi watershed. We've talked about all the water in the world, but what exactly is a watershed? What does that word really mean? And a watershed is really a land area that drains into a river, a lake, or another body of water. When it rains, the way that the land is shaped will direct our water to go to certain places. And so later on, we'll take a look at a watershed model. So there's two ways that we could analyze water quality of our watershed that are important to consider when we take a look at our model. The first are biotic factors. So these are living factors. So a great example could be birds, like our pelicans, or perhaps our trees, insects, or plants. We also have abiotic factors that could impact the water quality of our watershed. So these are non-living things and they never were living. And so among those, we have the sun, rain or water, even the use of fertilizers or nutrients, and soil. All right, so here is our watershed model. And so this is a really great way to visualize our watershed. So the water will travel the path of least resistance, and gravity will cause it to flow to the lowest point geographically. So the water flows downhill and collects in those lower areas. So if you take a look at our model here, you can see all of those arrows representing those high points and where the water would flow in a case of a rain event. And that's going to be draining into our streams, which will eventually drain to our rivers and to our dams. So it's important to consider in a watershed, you typically find things like agricultural fields or farms. You might also see those rivers or dams, also factories. And also in a watershed, you typically find cities, lots of buildings. So in these cities, you might find a grocery store or perhaps a shopping mall. And then we also have our residential areas where people will have their homes, and as well as parks too. So we can also have our parks there that can help. So now that we know more about the watershed, let's take a look at all the watersheds that we have in the US. There are many, but as you can see in the pink, this is our Mississippi watershed, and it is huge. So in fact, the Mississippi drainage basin covers all or parts of 32 different states in the United States, as well as 2 Canadian provinces. And this is the biggest watershed in the United States. So over 15 million people will rely on the Mississippi River between Cairo, Illinois, and Minneapolis. So this is an enormous natural resource for wildlife. For example, this watershed supports 260 different species of fish. Now, the highest point for this watershed is in Mount Elbert, which is in Colorado. It's actually the tallest mountain in Colorado and the Rocky Mountains, and the second tallest mountain in the United States. The lowest point of our watershed is going to be at the Mississippi River Delta, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana. And that's going to drain directly into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, compared to other watersheds all around the world in our major rivers, the Mississippi River is up in the top 5 alongside Amazon, Congo, and the Nile. So this is a very major, very important river. All right, so what about the water quality in our watershed? Who is relying on water in the Mississippi River watershed? Well, the people that are relying on it are really you and I. So people, we get a lot of resources from our watershed, as well as animals like birds, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then finally our plants as well. So what is water quality? Why is water quality important to people and animals? Well, it's because it's providing us many resources. For example, our drinking water or water to help grow, as well as food resources, shelter if you're a fish living in the river. And it even, believe it or not, contributes to clean air. So if we have clean, high quality water, we're going to have aquatic plants that are able to photosynthesize, which is further cleaning our air. And it's really a great thing. So what parameters can we look at when we're evaluating water quality? Well, you can test them chemically. So perhaps you could look at pH, temperature, nitrates, DO, which stands for dissolved oxygen. Oxygen's a very important thing, as well as turbidity, and that is the cloudiness of the water. And it's really very important to remember that all of these parameters can be altered by human impacts, specifically pollution. So I mentioned that human impacts can alter important water quality parameters and push their numbers to unhealthy ranges. This is typically seen through many different types of pollution, which we'll jump into after the slide. But first, I wanted you to take a look at this photo. This was actually taken by a kayaker in Memphis, Tennessee. Now just look at all of the litter that we have at the surface of the water. When I first looked at this photo, I thought it was of land because you can't even see into the water. Now, this is a picture that's pretty significant because Memphis is just down the river from St. Louis. They are downstream from us. Do you see any litter here that you recognize? So let's take a look at this map just to show you just how connected we all are. St. Louis, just up the river from Memphis. So whatever we're doing in our neighborhoods is affecting other communities, and that's really important to consider. All right, so let's talk about pollution. We have two different types of pollution, and one of those is our point source pollution, and it's pretty simple. It is pollution that can be tracked or traced back to a single source. Now, on our watershed model, this would be a great example of the industrial plant or factory. And the reason that is because you can trace the pollution back to that single source. So if you look at this photo here, we have that pipeline, and you can see directly where that pollution is coming from that's being dumped into that waterway. Another type is non-point source pollution, and this can be a little bit trickier. It originates from many sources and affects a wide area, so it can't necessarily be traced to one specific source, which is what makes it kind of difficult. Good examples of this would be car exhaust fumes. So the exhaust coming off of our cars, while it's not directly coming from one individual, it's coming from a collective group of multiple cars and can't be traced back to one. And other examples could be the use of fertilizers or litter and trash. All right, so let's actually talk about the different types of pollutants that we need to worry about when we're talking about water quality in the Mississippi watershed. And one of them, which I find is probably one of the most important, is our nitrates and fertilizers. So fertilizers and nitrates are really just salts or nutrients that can be used for plants. So when you utilize nitrates and fertilizers, it's really supporting plant growth. That seems like a good thing, right? But it isn't necessarily a good thing. Too much of a good thing is bad. And so plant populations can explode when there's an excess of nutrients in our water. And this can really cause dead zones. So if we have lots of fertilizers, if we draw it back to our watershed model, perhaps we have fertilizers on our farm or agricultural fields, or maybe even in your backyard on your grass. When it rains, it's going to follow those arrows down to our rivers. And this is what causes this photo on our right-hand side. Now this picture is a picture of Tampa Bay. So this is the Gulf of Mexico. And all of the fertilizers that we utilize will eventually end up in this Gulf. And as you can see, algae has absolutely taken over this ecosystem. And this is a huge problem. With an increase in nitrates, this will further increase the amount of plants that are growing in an aquatic ecosystem, which will, in the long run, decrease and suck out all of the oxygen in our water. And in return, will kill off our fish and other animals that need that oxygen in their water to survive. So here's a great photo to show you. This is showing the flow of nitrates on the Mississippi watershed. And so as you can see, even people utilizing fertilizers in Montana will eventually end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can just see how much of an issue it is if you're living, say, in Louisiana and you have all of these toxic algae just exploding in our ocean. Another great one to talk about is pesticides. So while this isn't necessarily like fertilizers to help your plants grow, pesticides are used to help protect your plants from other pests like insects. So pesticides are a chemical that can be used to either keep insects away or kill these pests. And most of them are made with very strong chemicals, and chemicals are not very good for our natural ecosystems. A really good example would be DDT. This was a pesticide that was used in the 1960s and 70s. And unfortunately, this very strong chemical impacted a lot of bird populations, specifically raptors, because this DDT, when it rains, it gets washed to our streams and to our rivers. And then the insects might eat something with that chemical on it. And then perhaps our fish are eating those insects. And then, of course, our eagles and our condors are eating these sources of food that are tainted with DDT. And so this caused birds to not be able to produce calcium in their eggs, which really brought down bird populations. So that's just one example of how these pesticides can have these unknown consequences. So it's really important to consider that. So in the long run, having pesticides in our watershed can increase the toxicity of the ecosystem. It can cause hormonal changes in the animals living there. It will decrease the amount of fish egg reproduction, and it will decrease your resistance to disease. Next, we have loose soil. So let's say we look back at our watershed model. Perhaps you are building a new shopping mall and you're doing a lot of construction. And so construction areas, or even areas where there's been habitat loss, like cutting down trees, have a very big impact on our water quality. This loose soil can get washed into our waterways during rain events or storms, and it can actually change the depth of the water, or it could even cover an entire layer of a riverbed, which would decrease an animal's ability to either lay or attach eggs. And so these impacts could be an increase in turbidity, or that murkiness or cloudiness in the water, could also increase the temperature. And with an increase in temperature, we're going to start to see our oxygen evaporating, as well as a resistance to disease is going to be decreasing. All right, another is animal waste. This one might be more relatable to you. If you are in a residential area and you might have some pets. I have 2 dogs, and they can certainly leave a lot of animal waste in my backyard. And it's important to consider that harmful bacteria can cause these organisms to become very ill. So when it's raining, it's washing these animal wastes into our waterways. And it's important to consider these impacts that animal waste has. So for example, this could increase, again, the turbidity, the temperature, and we're going to start seeing oxygen being taken out of our water column, as well as, again, a resistance to disease. And this is a great example of turbidity. And so if you look on the left, you'll see a beaker with very clear water, has a very, very low turbidity. And then on the alternative side, we have very high turbidity. This water looks very muddy, very murky. You can't see through it very well. And so if you were a fish, think about which one you'd prefer to live in. And then trash and litter. And this is probably one that directly at each and every one of you can help impact is the amount of litter and trash that we have on Earth. And this can affect human and animals in a variety of ways. So litter like plastics can cause entanglements of animals. So like fishing lines and things, animals can get trapped in there and eventually could die. Also, plastics can hold on to a lot of toxic chemicals. So it will leach into plastics, and plastics can be mistaken for food too. And so if you ingest these plastics and they have these toxic chemicals on them, that's going to be a major concern. So again, it's going to increase our turbidity, increase the risk of disease, and it could likely cause more algal blooms. So it's important to remember that runoff affects water quality. Every time we have a rain event, anything that we're putting out into the environment is ending up in our rivers and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's very important that we try to protect our waterways. So what can we do to help improve water quality? How can we change some of these impacts that our water is facing? So what are some things that you can do in your own home? One of those things can be to not litter and try to increase the amount that you're recycling. So try to reduce the amount of waste you have. And if you do have waste, try to dispose of it properly. You could also utilize non-toxic cleansers and detergents. And so with this, you're going to have much less chemicals washing down your drains and eventually into our streams. And so there's lots of really great recipes and instructions online if you're interested in making your own non-toxic cleansers at home. You could also consider your water efficiency. So, you know, the classic, turn off the sink while you're brushing your teeth is a really great way to start. And then start thinking about other ways that you can impact your water efficiency at home. This will help you save money, and it's going to help our waterways in return. And there's lots of resources online on how you can do that. Finally, energy efficiency. Start thinking about the amount of energy you're using and be conservative. And so if you're not using an appliance, go ahead and unplug it. Now in your yard, there's lots of things you can do. And one of the most important, I'd say, is planting native plants in your yard. And so native plants are very important because they're firstly they're beautiful to look at, and they're providing food sources and habitat to animals in our area. And in addition to that, they're going to decrease the amount of erosion that you might have, as well as slow down that flowing water. Think back to our watershed model when you saw those arrows going down the hills. The more plants that we have, the slower the flow of water. And so this will really help impact cleaner water, and that is being introduced into our rivers. Another is avoiding the use of fertilizers. And if you do use fertilizers, try to use natural ones. So in this picture here, you can see this is composting. So you can actually take your scrap vegetables, scrap fruits, and take those and reintroduce them into your soil. So by composting, you're helping reduce the amount of food waste that is going to landfills, and you're also pumping nutrients back into your soil. So this is another cost-effective thing that you can do. You can also get a rain barrel. So anytime it rains, it will collect into these barrels, and then eventually you could use those to water your plants. And another thing to consider is using low emission power equipment. All right, how about in your driveway or your car? Perhaps you have a car and you like to drive around. Consider washing your car at a commercial store. In fact, commercial stores are required to treat the water that they utilize to wash their cars before it is actually being entered into a waterway. And so they also recycle the water. So they are very good at conserving that water. And so that's a good place to start. Another thing you could do is carpool or use public transportation. It's a fun way to save a buck and to help the environment. And then finally, to get better gas mileage, help maintain your car and start thinking about how you're going to dispose of certain chemicals. So make sure that you don't have any leaking oil, but also if you do need to dispose of chemicals, make sure you do them the proper way. So in this picture, you can see antifreeze and the potential to contaminate 2 million gallons of water. So it's very important that we take care of these different chemicals so we aren't putting them into our waterways. All right, now with that, I want to thank you guys for joining me for this presentation today. And it's important to remember that while so many pollutant types are out there that can impact the water quality of the Mississippi watershed, it is still something that you can do. You have an impact to help this. And so again, we want to thank you guys for listening, and we hope that you learned something new today about our watershed. And we want to invite you to choose one thing that you can do to help this week, and even invite your family or friends to participate. And you can be the one that makes the difference. So if you're interested in exploring more about watersheds, be sure to check out our crumpled paper watershed activity following this presentation. And remember that if you conserve water, you conserve life.